Shalom, hello, this is Rabbi Johnny Solomon, and welcome to my online Chumash Rashi Shir dedicated to my dear friend Lenny Borja Yudalei Ben Shmuel. This Shabbat we read Parshat Tzav, and in this shiur we're going to be covering a number of psukim and mefarshim which I hope enrich your understanding of the parsha, which is one of those parshiyot which is often overlooked or misunderstood. Let us begin. We begin with the first avodah performed every day in the Bet HaMikdash, or in the Mishkan and then the Bet HaMikdash, namely the Trumat HaDeshen. What is the Trumat HaDeshen? In the previous day, of course, there were all these different korbanot, and what do the korbanot leave? They leave ashes. And the first task of the Kohanim is to remove the ashes from the Mizbeach. At the same time, there are moments when the ashes build up to such an extent the actual Mizbeach has to be cleaned. And so, what we have here are two mitzvot. In Perek Gimel, we're told the following: "V'lavash hakohen midavad michlesei bad yilvash al basaro, ve'erim et hadeshen asher tochal ha'esh al ola al mizbech v'samo etzel ha'mizbech." So that discusses the mitzvah of what we call the Trumat HaDeshen, of removing the ashes from the mizbech. But then the second pasuk that we have here, that is Perek Vav pasuk Dalet, informs us, "Ufashat et begadav v'lavash begadim acherim v'otzi et hadeshen el michutz machane el makom tahor." What happens when you have the build-up of the ashes? Well, then the Kohanim have to remove those ashes and clean the mizbeach, and that is the otzat hadeshen. That is the taking out of the ashes. And you'll note in the psukim we're told that the Kohen wears his basic 4 clothes uniform for the first mitzvah, but then he's told to switch to wear basically older clothes for the messier task of removing all those ashes. And on this says Rashi the following: "Fashat begadav en zu chava ela derech eret shelo yilachlech b'otzat hadeshen begadim shu meshamesh behem tamid." This is not an absolute obligation, but it's good practice to basically not wear your proper big day kahuna, at least the ones that you regularly wear, to doing this task. Instead, you're going to wear an older set of big day kahuna to get rid of the ashes. Begadim shebishel behem k'dera l'rabo, al yimzok behem kos l'rabo. As Rashi says, the kind of clothes you wear for messy cooking, you wouldn't wear when pouring your master some wine. L'kach v'lavash begadim acherim pchutim mehem. That's what it means here in Pasuk Dalet, where we're told he puts on different clothes, meaning ones which are either older or more worn, etc. So as we said, we talk about here two different things. One is the removal of the ashes from the Mizbech, and the other is removal of the ashes from away from the Mizbech and the cleaning of the Mizbech. And I want to bring to your attention two beautiful commentaries. The first comes from Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and here he discusses the mitzvah, begadim acherim, these two are big day kohuna, but they are pchotim, inferior, because, of course, again, we just don't want to do a disservice to that Kohen's primary clothes. Otzat HaDeshen prescribed here clears the altar of the remains of the previous day's offerings, thus preparing it for the avodah of the new day. Apparently, Otzat HaDeshen too is an avodah. Meaning, what is that significant of? Think about it. What Rav Hirsch is saying is getting rid of the ashes from the Mizbeach. Clearly that's part of the avodah, in order to clear the Mizbeach to be ready for the next day's offerings. But removing the ashes which are now by the side of the Mizbeach, surely that's just kind of a menial task. But Rav Hirsch says here, no, it's part of the avodah, and we're going to come back to that point soon. But then continues Rav Hirsch and says something majestic. Trumat HaDeshen begins the avodah of the new day by recalling the avodah of the previous day. Hotzat HaDeshen, the clearing of all the of all the ashes mentioned in Pasuk Dalet, signifies that at the same time the Jewish nation must begin its task anew each day. The start of every new day summons us to set out upon our task with full and fresh devotion, as though we had never accomplished anything before. The memory of yesterday's accomplishments must not inhibit today's performance. Thoughts of what had already been accomplished are likely to choke off all initiative for new accomplishments. Woe to him who is smug with satisfaction over his past achievements, who does not begin the work of each new day as though it were the very first day of his life's work. So, what Rav Hirsch does is something fantastic. He says, The first mitzvah in Pasuk Gimel is about reminding ourselves today of yesterday. The second Pasuk, meaning Pasuk Daled, is about saying we can start afresh. And sure, there's carryover of who we are from one day to another, but there's also, says Rav Hirsch, a need to start each day saying this day can count on its own. Now, continuing with our analysis of these psukim, I want to bring to your attention the thoughts of Rabbi Nachman Schneerson the Lubavitcher Rebbe in his Biurim Perush Rashi al Torah. And we'll just mention a couple of comments from here. He says, meaning Rashi says two different things. One is cooking for your master, and one is pouring wine for your master. The cooking you generally don't do in front of him, but the pouring wine you do. One is by the Mizbeach, meaning the clearing of the ashes. The other one is taking it away from the Mizbeach, and that is comparable to the messier work of cooking. Now, then he goes on to tell us the following. Why does Rashi tell us this? Meaning, can I not work out which one's messier? That should be quite evident. It's not just to tell us that the clothes are going to get dirtier. The fact is, clothes can get dirty with lots of other different parts of the avodah. The truth is, with Pasuk Gimel, meaning the Trumat that too can be messier. The He says something lovely. When you're doing something in front of your master, any mess that comes about is part of the service. Whereas, for example, when you're doing things which are away from your master, such as the cooking, that mess is a whole different type of mess. But then he goes on and tells us something very interesting. And he says we can learn two lessons from these two different avodah. Aleph, avodat Hashem tzricha liot lo rak b'mitzvot b'fo'al, ela gam b'hachana shel mitzvah. He says we learn something interesting from these two acts of service. Number one is, service isn't just the thing you do, it's the thing you need to do the thing you need to do. כפי שמסופר של רבי חייא שעסק לא רק בעצם הלימוד עם התלמידים אלא גם בהכנות השונות. Here he gives an example, Rabbi Chia, that when he taught his students, he didn't just teach them, he basically showed them all the preparations necessary for the teaching. For example, he's talking about here the preparation of the parchments for the writing of Sifrei Torah. ועשה זאת באות המסירה ונתינה שהייתה לו במצווה עצמה. שכן מצד גודל הביטול לרצון העליון, אין נפקא מינה באיזה דבר נדרש מליווי הרצון העליון, ועושים מעשה בהכשר למצווה בגוף המצווה. Basically, we often sometimes say this is not the real thing, and this is the real thing. This is just the preparation, and this is the main act. This is secondary and this is primary. But what we see from the grouping together of this service is, even the thing that seems to be just secondary to the avodah, namely the clearing of the Mizbeach, that itself is avodah. That was a point made, if you recall, by Rav Hirsch. Then continues the Lubavitcher Rebbe and says the following: Adam eni yachol lomar shu yinaseh להשפיע רק על יהודי הנמצא במקום רבו, בדל אדמות של תורה ותפילה. ואת ההשפעה של יהודי נמצא חוץ מהמחנה ישאיר לכהן אחר. He says, notice something interesting. It's the same person, just both. You can't outsource and say, I'm going to help people when they're in the right place. And to get them into the right place, I want somebody else entirely. אותו עבד המוזג כוס לרבו הוא שיוצא לחוץ מהמחנה ועובד שם את עבודתו. באופן עבודה בזה הוא שצריך ללבוש בגדים אחרים. He tells us basically, in terms of kiruv levavot, but kiruv chokim, helping others, outreach to others, truth be told, all other aspects of Jewish service, we shouldn't outsource the messy work to somebody else. It's essential that we get involved. We shouldn't basically say, prepare people and then I'll welcome them. We should be part of every aspect of the work that we have to do. That is Rav Hirsch, that is the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Let us move on. Move on to two different psukim. We are told a couple of psukim later on, Esh tamid tukal mizbeach lo tichbeh, that there should be a continuous fire on Mizbeach. Rashi then comments here. And then later on in Perek Zayin, we told about an Isur called Pigul. Let's read what the Isur Pigul is all about. Anotami basar hazevach b'yom hashlishi be'esh yisaref v'mo'achel yachal m'basar zevach shlamav b'yom hashlishi lo yiratzeh ha'makriv oto lo yechashev lo Pigul yeh v'nefesh ochel b'meno onatisa. What is left over from the flesh of the sacrifice on the third day shall be burnt in fire, and if any of the flesh of his peace offering is to be eaten on the third day, it shall not be accepted. It shall not count for the one who offers it. Rather, it shall be rejected, pigul, and the person who eats of it shall bear his sin. So that tells us that there's a time limit on what is eaten, and says Rashi here, and you'll see it. Rashi says when you basically bring the korban, you need to make sure you have in mind to consume the korban at the right time. And this leads Rav Steinsaltz to say something fantastic about these two sets of psukim. One about the Esh Tamid, and one about the Pigul and Nota. That means a meat left over. He says the laws of the Korbanot contain an additional element. The laws of Pigul and Nota which set time limits for partaking of the Korban. The purpose of these laws is to ensure that the Korban does not turn into a game, and that the consumption of the Korban does not turn into a picnic. The time limits serve to curtail the element of convenience inherent in certain korbanot. Hence, the thanksgiving offering which a person brings when he is in a good mood is allocated at a especially short time frame, only 1 day and 1 night. If a person experiences a miracle and wants to give thanks to God, he goes to the temple and brings a korban. But once he does this, he must finish it as quickly as he can, for otherwise the meat will assume the status of nata, leftover meat, and become unfit for consumption. Not only must he prevent this from happening, but he may not even think of consuming it after the time limit. So what's this all about? Continues Rabbi Steinsaltz, at the root of the matter is the obligation to bring a korban requires an acknowledgement and understanding of the element of sacrifice that it entails, not the sacrifice of the animal, but the sacrifice of the self. When one brings a korban, it is acceptable to relax to some extent, on the condition this relaxation derives from a basic love of God and awareness of his presence. But if this goes beyond relaxing, entering the realm of nonchalance and irreverence, that is where the problem begins. Continues Rabbi Steinsaltz, a sacrificial act is fundamental to the process of bringing a korban, and this kind of act necessarily involves tension. The moment an attempt is made to relieve this tension, it is no longer a proper korban, meaning a person brings it, but they're bound into the time limits of the Dinei Korbanot, and that is where Pigul and Nota come in. This same reason can explain the concept of Pigul as well. Pigul is not just a problem of bad intentions, it is about the attempt to make the process of bringing a korban more convenient. This korban is fundamentally flawed because the attempt to deprive it of the element of tension also deprives it of its essence. Okay, so now what he's done is discussed the concept of Pigul and Nota and how Korbanot isn't just about what you bring, but how you bring. You have to bring it, and it puts you in a moment of tension, having to consume the Korban within a fixed amount of time. And now he does something fantastic, because he explains the meaning of this and the relationship with the concept of Esh Tamid Tukad and Mizbeach Tamid. These two concepts, Nota and Pigul, and the continuous fire, are problems that are inherent for the life of the Jew who keep the mitzvot. The first problem is that of Pigul and Nota. The korban is disqualified not only when it's actually left over beyond the prescribed time limit, but even when one merely thinks about how much easier it would be had he not been so pressurized. Even for a completely devout individual, it is natural for some to sometimes prefer that religious life be a little easier, for sure. Why is it so difficult for many of us to get up in the morning and pray? Is it so painful? What bothers people is that the daily requirement, even when there's no time to pray, or when there's not in their mood, and this makes all the difference. The moment that one decides to change the rules and eat the korban on the third day, the Torah cuts in, it is considered pigul, and it will not be counted in his favor. One is taking something that was a korban and making a picnic out of it. If the intention is to make it easier, more convenient, more pleasant, it is considered pigul. And then he continues, he says, the second problem is the continuous fire. To be sure, a person cannot live constantly in an elevated state of burning enthusiasm. He cannot tolerate a constant stream of momentous life events. Nevertheless, there's one aspect of our lives that must retain a constant spiritual high, the continuous fire. When one brings a korban, it must remain and burn upon the altar. Although this may seem undramatic, we should remember that the continuous fire, which can burn quietly and in secret, must continue to burning all day and all night. A fire can be kept continuously burning upon the altar, it shall not be extinguished. So what he's basically said is, we live in tension, and there's a heightened level of tension and sacrifice when you bring a korban. And yet there's also this continuous, perpetual, persistent need to feel a burning sensation, namely a connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and a desire to worship God. And that really is a bit like what Rav Hirsch said before, that we carry things over from day to day. That is a tamid. And yet at the same time we have moments every day in which we have a duty and opportunity to serve God in unique ways, sometimes with a certain more relaxed way, but oftentimes with some tension. We come now to Perek Chet Pasuk Bet. קח את אהרון ואת בניו איתו ואת הבגדים ואת שמן המשחה ואת פר חטאת ואת שני העלים ואת צל המצות. What does kach mean? What does take mean? Take Aaron. Did it mean that Moshe had to take him with his hand? Says Rashi, kachenu b'dvarim moshchehu. Take him with persuasive words and attract him. And this led me to want to look at the source of Rashi, which is done so beautifully in Lifshutosh and Rashi by Rabbi Shmuel Gelbart, where he shows us the Midrashim and the Gemarot which inform Rashi's commentary. And here he quotes the Torah Kohanim, as you can see here's the words of Rashi, Kachenu b'dvarim moshchehu, and says the Torah Kohanim, it lists us numerous times where the word kach is used about Moshe in not pulling people with their arm or taking somebody physically, but instead encouraging somebody and bringing somebody towards doing something. On many occasions, Moshe uses the word kach, or the word kach is used about Moshe in terms of what he says to them. ולקחת את הלוויים לי, אני השם, ולקחת אותם אל אוהל מועד, ויקח משה את האנשים האלה אשר נקראו בשמות, קח לך את יהושע בן נון, וכי מפשיל היה משה בני אדם לאחריו, אלא אמר לו הקדוש ברוך הוא, קחם את דברים שלא יהיה ליבם לדבר אחר. Meaning what Moshe was told with the word kach is to bring people into a certain mindset, involve them into a certain project. And that's what the word kach means. And as Rabbi Gelbart then continues, kicha shel anashim muvoed shachnoam, as if to say to appease them and to involve them and to engage them. We often forget how the power of words can be used not just to hurt people, but to engage people. And the very fact the word kach is used here shows how Moshe did this not just here, but in numerous other places in the Torah. We come to our final pasuk. V'yas Aaron uvanav et kol hadvarim asher tzivah Hashem biyad Moshe. This is the final pasuk actually of Parshat Tzav. And Aaron and his sons did all the things that the Lord commanded through Moshe. And says Rashi, lagid shivchan shlahatui yuminasmo. Right? This tells us praise of the Aaron and his sons. They didn't deviate from what they were asked to do, left or right. And asked Rav Baruch Mordechai Ezrachi in his Birkat Mordechai something interesting. The Tzarech Biur, halo b'chol ha'parsha ne'emar kama v'chama pamim kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe. Throughout the parsha and the previous parashah and parsha as well, we're told kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe, as God had commanded Moses, or kachol asher tzivah Hashem et Moshe, or according to all that God had commanded Moshe. What do we learn here from the words v'yas? And he says something very, very interesting. When it says ka'asher with a chaf, or kachol with a chaf, what does chaf indicate? Basically, proximate to. He says, I think this pasuk, this final pasuk of Tzav is important. Why? Because in all the other psukim relating to Moshe, we have kachol or ka'asher. And chaf talks about doing things just like what God asks. V'yas Aaron uvanav et kol hadvarim asher tzivah Hashem b'yad Moshe doesn't have a chaf. Instead, it tells us they did it exactly without veering to the right or the left, without doing anything even slightly different to the command of Kodesh Baruch Hu. Says Rabbi Ezrachi, "V'mashma'ut hi she'etzel Aaron uvanav amar katuv shekniatam v'hitlabtutam hitbatlutam l'dvar Hashem," that your humility towards serving God and your self-annulment in doing the will of God, haytam le'amamash, was absolute. Ki et kol hadvarim v'zeh yoter meduyak me'asher kol hadvarim. When you compare the phrase et kol hadvarim that we have in this pasuk from kol hadvarim said about Moshe, which suggests greater accuracy in doing what God said, it's this pasuk. B'chol yishtamshu b'gam b'chaf hadimyon. V'asher tzivah Hashem zeh yoter meduyak. So he goes on to say, diuk zeh, this noticing this difference, masigim rak toch k'dei hitbatlut mle'ah l'tzav Torah, demonstrates his absolute self-annulment in terms of fulfilling the command of the Torah. Darga zot, this level, eno novat mitiv shel ha'asiyah atzma, doesn't just come from the act of doing, elo mitiv ishiyut shel bana ma'aseh v'asiyah. Instead, it also captures the very essence and the personality of the person doing the act, namely the Kohanim. Zoti ha'kavanah shelo atu yamin u'shmol. This is what Rashi is telling us. They didn't veer to the right or to the left. Zeh hu omek mashmut dargata. Zeh pshat limudam ukor. He says, I believe this is what Rashi is alluding to. So, just to summarize, Parshat Tzav, we began by talking about both the removing of the ashes from the altar and the removing of the ashes from away from the altar, and one being messier than the other, the analogy of Rashi between pouring wine before your master, which is the ashes on the altar, and the cooking away from your master, which is dealing with a messier thing, and that's why they had to change their clothes. From here, Rav Hirsch teaches us how we can start each day anew, and from here the Lubavitcher Rebbe tells us that both preparatory acts are part of the avodah, and that we shouldn't separate between, shall we say, the messier things that need to be done and the essential things that have to be done or are part of the avodah. We went on to talk about those two psukim of Esh Tamid and the notion of Pigul, which led Rav Steinsaltz to tell us what is the duty of a Jew. It is to live in this tension, but also to continue to have that fire burning within us. We mentioned here this idea of kachet Aaron, kachem b'dvarim, take a person with words. You can encourage a person, lift a person, engage a person with words. And we ended up with Rabbi Mordechai Ezrachi, who says, what is the meaning of this pasuk, V'yas Aaron uvanav et kol hadvarim asher tzivah Hashem b'yad Moshe, is to tell us they did exactly what Hashem asked them to do, and that's ultimately the idea of hitbatlut, this idea of self-annulment towards servicing HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is ultimately exemplified by the Kohanim. I wish you all Shabbat Shalom.